shifting the gear to what's going on in Venezuela and in the United States, we know that the Trump administration has decided to kidnap the president of Venezuela and bring it to the United States to face justice, as they call it. But when you look at the whole case, kidnapping a president, the president of Venezuela, and I I don't know what else can be done to just destroy the international law. But in the case of the international law, when you look at the whole situation with Venezuela, what comes to your mind? And how can we understand this sort of, you know, action on the part of the president of the United States, who's one of the most powerful presidents on this planet?
Well, obviously, there's a multiplicity of issues there. In my book on governing on fake news, I addressed the question of Venezuela during the first mandate of President Trump, with the whole issue of Juan Guaido and all that. And I went digging into the whole issue of who were the election at that time, or how the legality of the Maduro government and all that. And in fact, it's very interesting because what I exposed already at that time is that the US already at that time tried to fabricate literally a case against Venezuela. And we have found exactly the same thing today. The, the whole, before going into the specifics, we are here addressing something that we have addressed many times, but probably people have not understood the real scope of that. In fact, this shows exactly that we have shifted from the international law based order to the international rules based order. It's no longer the law that constitutes the reference point when you assess a situation. They are rules, rules which are defined by whoever, in that case, by the US. Obviously, this is the most aggressive country. It has the power of being aggressive. It has the presence, military presence all over the world. It uses also all the clandestine assets, the CIA and others to influence things. And that's probably what happened in Venezuela, by the way, this case. Well, I don't want to discuss all the specifics because I haven't studied that in all details. But apparently, what the current situation has shown is that people were bribed, or you had some kind of, in fact, corruption done by the US in order to obtain the removal of President Maduro. But all that is based not on international law, because obviously this would be prohibited by international law, but is in fact authorized by the rules which are defined by the US. And that's where we see, for instance, you have some accusations that have been um, established, yes, established by the U.S. government, namely this famous cartel of the Suns, or I don't remember exactly the name of this cartel, that allegedly Maduro was leading or coordinating or whatever. And now that Maduro is in the U.S., he's facing trial. They have dropped that charge, and they even said that this cartel never existed. So it shows that they completely fabricated the case from A to Z. And you will see, again, we started this program with my personal case. And of course, I'm not, not a case as important as Maduro. But you have some similarities here, that you just fabricate a case just to make your point. It's no longer the law that is the reference. It's just the rules that you establish. That's exactly the human rights. In my case, would define that or oblige any country, because every country, or normally in the EU has some rules to deprive someone from basic freedoms, but it's not been applied. So we are not in the field of the law. We are in the field of the rules that have been defined arbitrarily without any consent from from the consent of the population. So these are rules established by a ruling party or camarilla, clique, junta, you can call it as you want, not elected, who decide the rules. And that's exactly what we have. And that's exactly what we have here in Venezuela as well. So what this case demonstrates, and I can, of course, it's in the situation where I am, I relate although they are substantially distinct, but in essence, it comes back to the same lawlessness in which we are right now. That everybody, I mean, this is the law of the strongest. Period. You define who is good and who is bad. It's not the legality that defines the right, it's the legitimacy. Legality is, well, when you follow the law, and the law has the red lines, and if you cross the red lines you are out of the law. It's as simple as that. I mean, the line may be wider or thinner, depend on the case, but as a principle, the law defines the limits of what you're allowed to do, and where you cross the limits, then you are out of the law. That's the legality or illegality. When you talk about legitimacy or illegitimacy, you're talking about not the legality, but the perception of legality. Even if you can say a country, and now we are talking about Venezuela, but we may well be talking about Iran in a couple of weeks from now. You know, Iran has different, I mean, or Venezuela or Iran may have different laws, different practices, different customs in their political system, in the way they elect people, the way the country is ruled, and all that. We define, we tend to say that even if it is legal in the country, we say it's illegitimate because population cannot say this or that. As I said many times, I'm come from Switzerland. Switzerland is, let's say, it's considered as a democratic country because we vote for almost every important decision. The population votes for that through referendums. And of course, we decide on almost everything. Country. We decide on if we should build a new highway, a tunnel in the Alps, or raise the taxes, or buy a new aircraft. We even voted to dismantle or to disband the army. Well, the population refused that, but I mean, we even voted for that. So we vote for everything. Now, if I look at France, for instance, which is just a country just next door, they claim to be democratic, but when I see the decision they take, which are not supported by the population, which are only supported by a clique of politicians, often corrupt, who even go to prison because of corruption, by the way. What is, they claim to be democratic, but this is not the same democracy as we have in Switzerland. So, what is the baseline to measure democracy? The system in France is probably legal. I mean, probably not corruption, but let's say the system is legal. But with Swiss eyes, I could say, well, it's not legitimate because it doesn't respect the will of the population. Because with my eyes, I have a certain point of view that allows me to adjust the perception of the system in France. So France claim to be democratic, but I have said many times, and I wrote that in my books. For me, France is not a democracy; it's an elective monarchy. Period. You just elect the king. This is, and if you look at the structure of France, by the way, you would say that it's almost the same structures as the one you had under the monarchy. So, as you see, think like this: when you have Maduro kidnapped by the the U.S. government, what is the reaction in Europe? Had any outrage in Europe? Surprisingly, they claim to be Democrat. They claim to follow the law and the rule of law and all that. But when it comes to the kidnapping of Maduro, what is the reaction of the EU? They just say Maduro was not legitimate. They don't say he was not legal. They are not legitimate, meaning it's a matter of perception. And again, we are here in the field of perception. We are not in the field of what is measurable, what can be defined through articles of law and things like this. We are into something which is undefined. Legitimacy is not really defined. Is that the polls that define the legitimacy? And as you know, if let's assume it's that, but we everybody knows that the polls may give different results depending on to whom you ask the question. So what is legitimacy? You and but that's the reaction we have in Europe. It's not based on law, it's based on rules. And that's the evolution we are seeing today, I think, in the world. And that's extremely concerning because that means that the decisions are in fact based on arbitrary uh, the arbitrary decisions, not based on something that you can verify, but based on something which is moving depending on who decides. And and that's where we are with the whole issue of the sanctions and all that, not just for the my case, by the way, but for everything we have, because now we see also that instead of going through diplomatic processes or negotiation processes, we apply sanctions. It's a policy of coercion everywhere. And that applies, by the way, to Switzerland as well. I mean, Switzerland is the second country that sanctions the most Russia. I mean, the first being the United States, the second is Switzerland, and then you have the European Union also. I mean, this may have changed, but that's the status of August last year. It may have changed in between, but nevertheless, even if it's a third one, you don't expect to see Switzerland as a sanctioning country, especially because it's neutral, and especially also not just because it's neutrality, but also because the mere existence and the mere purpose, I would say, almost of Swiss foreign policy was precisely to stay in the middle, to be to provide an opportunity for different parties to talk together. Once you take the position of one party, you can no longer be the mediator in that. And that's where we see this very strong change. And Switzerland is very a symbol of that. But beyond the case of Switzerland, it's something we have witnessed since all these the conflict. We have talked many times about the conflict in Palestine, for instance, and even with Iran, we have mentioned that. We know that actions of Israel were illegal and even illegitimate, by the way. But what was the reaction of the EU? No reaction. So they have this kind of flexible understanding of the situation. Sometimes, when it suits them, they condemn violation of international law, and when it doesn't suit them, they don't do anything. And when they cannot improve things, and when they don't have the capacity or the capability to address a situation as we used to in the past through diplomacy, through foreign relations, and all that, they just apply sanctions. And in fact, that's exactly what we have. We have just an extreme case with Venezuela, but in substance, it's exactly that. Do what I told you to do. Otherwise, I'll kidnap your president. Otherwise, I'll impose sanctions on you. Otherwise, I will send my troops. I will overthrow your government and things like this. You know, today we are talking about Denmark. Is the government of Denmark is certainly legal, but is it legitimate? Is the government of Denmark legitimate? Does the US consider the government of Denmark as legitimate? They fabricated a cartel for the purpose of indicting Maduro. They can fabricate another cartel for the president of Denmark. What would be the difference? And that's where we are. We are in a system which is in fact a scheme which is extremely close to organized criminality, where you define the rules because you are the strongest. The rule of law that was created at the end of World War II, I mean, not the rule of law, the international law system that emerged out of World War II, was precisely designed to avoid that a powerful actor could impose its will on others. Of course, this powerful actor at that time was Germany. Germany had been more or less, I mean, I said more or less because historian may discuss that, but in any case, Germany was considered as the initiator of two world wars. And the idea was to prevent that such a case could emerge again. And therefore, the international law was built in such a way that nobody could emerge as, uh, let's say, as a power that could impose its will. The problem is that with the years, and especially because after the end of the Cold War, Russia in particular, but also China, were not as powerful as the West and especially the US. They were not able to play the role that they were supposed to play in this international law system in the Security Council of the UN. You know, the Security Council of the UN was crafted at the end of World War II, where you had the winners. I mean, basically, these were the winners of World War II, meaning that they were the most powerful nations. And they were supposed to remain powerful and to have a balance of power within the Security Council. Doesn't mean that the system was perfect, but it allowed to have some kind of balance and allowed to have the let's say this international law system working at least during the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, as the US emerged as the most powerful country in the world, not just because the economy, but also because of its worldwide military presence. Nota bene, the US military is, I think, the only military in the world which is organized around worldwide structures. You see, most countries have divisions, army corps, but the US forces are arranged around continent: South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, Eastern Asia, and so on and so forth. So it's the structure of the armed forces is of the US is already organized around in a global manner. But and at the end of the Cold War, as I said, Russia was definitely weakened, and it's recovering now, but it took almost 30 years to have the, let's say, a significant presence. And that's why now the Americans start to respect Russia. Almost the same way with China. China had a very a slow development up to the year 2000s, and since the year 2000s it has an accelerating development. uh, but at the end of the Cold War, China was still almost a developing country. You may remember those pictures of all those people with bicycles in Beijing and all that. All of them having the same kind of outfit and things like this. Today, if you look at the Chinese society, it's totally different from the one we had even 30 years ago. Meaning that just after the end of the Cold War, the US could take advantage of the supremacy it had, and it started to build its power at that time. And today, the US power starts to be challenged by the Russian one and the Chinese one. And that's create the conflict. Let's say not the conflict, direct conflict, because the US start to understand, but it feeds this idea of making America great again. And probably this is one of the rationale behind the willingness of the US to take control over the whole of the so-called Western Hemisphere, which is essentially the American continent. So that's the mechanics of the whole thing. The problem is that Security Council and the international law system suffered from that because within the UN, the US decides. They are the main contributor. And I have been several years working for the UN, and you can see that basically almost the US decide almost everything. They are present everywhere because they pay for everything. And if the UN, when the Kofi Annan, for instance, um, expressed the idea of restructuring the UN and having coming back to something which is more equal, if you want, to have to come back to the real international law system, if you want,